The glass isn't shaking on its own. The tremor comes from the hand holding it. It's 1958, inside a Hollywood Hills mansion, at the kind of party where careers are quietly made or ruined somewhere between the appetizers and dessert. Marlon Brando stands at the center of the room, his shirt half unbuttoned, his eyes burning with that famous intensity, the same intensity that won him an Oscar, terrified directors, and made grown men look away. He points at Dean Martin and speaks, his voice slicing through the jazz and the laughter, declaring that you are everything that's wrong with the industry. The room falls silent. 43 people, studio heads, starlets, writers, directors, are frozen in place, each holding their breath because Marlon Brando has just challenged the king of cool. Dean Martin is smiling, not nervously or defensively, but with the calm confidence of a man who has been waiting for this moment. What he whispers next will be quoted in Hollywood for the next 50 years. But before those 6 words matter, you need to understand why Brando hated Dean Martin and why Dean Martin didn't care. To understand that night, you have to understand the war tearing Hollywood apart in 1958. On one side was the method. Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift. They didn't act, they became. They clawed into their own souls, pulled out their darkest memories and spilled them onto the screen. Brando stayed in character for weeks, refused to memorize lines so directors hid cue cards around the set, reshaped his body and mind until he was no longer Marlon Brando, but the role itself. Critics called it genius. The Actors Studio called it a revolution. Hollywood called it the future. On the other side stood the old guard, Cary Grant, Clark Gable, and Dean Martin. They didn't dig inward, didn't suffer, didn't bleed. They showed up on time, hit their marks, delivered their lines, and went home. Dean Martin was the poster child for that philosophy. He famously refused to rehearse. 1 take, maybe 2, and then off to the golf course. Directors who pushed for more were politely but firmly told to find another actor. Dean had learned something in Steubenville that Brando never understood. In the steel mills and gambling rooms of Ohio, you didn't survive by exposing your soul. You survived by hiding it. The mask wasn't weakness, it was armor. Marcus Webb, a 26-year-old junior publicist at Paramount, had been sent to the party to keep an eye on the talent. He would spend the next 40 years keeping his mouth shut about what he saw, until now. But Marcus didn't know what was coming. None of them did. Marlon Brando had been drinking since noon, and he decided that tonight he would teach Dean Martin a lesson about art. The party was held at the home of a studio executive whose name no longer matters. What matters is who was there. Frank Sinatra held court by the piano, a cigarette balanced between his fingers, his laugh slicing through the room like a blade, his cold blue eyes fixed on Brando as he watched and waited. Sammy Davis Jr. was making everyone laugh, his energy filling every corner of the room, until even he felt the tension and stopped mid-joke when Brando began to move. Natalie Wood, young and luminous, observed everything with dark, unblinking eyes. She would later say she knew something was coming, though she didn't know what. And Dean Martin leaned against the bar, tie loosened, a glass in his hand, what everyone assumed was bourbon. His posture was loose, relaxed, the stance of a man without a care in the world. The drink in his hand was apple juice, though no one knew that yet. Brando had been watching Dean all night, watching him tell jokes, charm the women, draw laughter from the room without breaking a sweat, doing nothing that resembled work at all. It enraged him. Brando had spent 3 months preparing for his last role, starving himself, studying, suffering, living as the character, breathing as the character, dreaming as the character. And Dean Martin had simply wandered onto the set of Some Came Running, improvised half his scenes, and walked away with better reviews. Critics called Dean effortlessly magnetic. They called Brando intense. Brando didn't want to be intense. He wanted to be magnetic. And he couldn't understand how a man who didn't seem to try could outshine someone who gave everything. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. It wasn't how things were supposed to work. Brando pushed forward through the crowd, and people parted for him, as they always did. His shoulders were tight, his jaw locked, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Brando stopped 3 feet from Dean. "I've been watching you," he said. Dean lifted his glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. "A lot of people do, P." The jazz kept playing, but everyone within earshot had gone still. No talking, no movement, no breath. Brando pressed on, calling Dean a poser who'd gotten lucky, a man who memorized lines and hit marks but felt nothing, became no one, stayed empty. Dean didn't move. He didn't flinch or set down his drink. His jaw stayed loose, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes steady. He simply waited. Brando had money, Oscars, and the respect of every serious actor in Hollywood, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had challenged Dean Martin to a fight he couldn't win. You can't hurt a man who doesn't care what you think. What followed took less than a minute, yet it would be whispered about for decades. The room held its breath. Marcus Webb would later say he could hear his own heartbeat, 43 people silent, listening to the soft clink of ice in a glass. The jazz trio softened to a distant murmur, as if even the music sensed what was unfolding. The air was thick with expensive perfume and cigarette smoke. Brando kept going, his voice rising. Acting, he said, was truth, ripping your insides out and showing them to the world, feeling every emotion until it destroyed you. He stepped closer, close enough for Dean to smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough to see the veins standing out in Brando's neck. He demanded to know what Dean felt up there on stage, pretending to be drunk, singing his little songs. What did he really feel? Dean didn't step back, didn't blink, didn't so much as twitch. "I feel," he said slowly, "like I want another drink." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room, unsure and brittle. Brando's face darkened. That, he snapped, was exactly the problem. Dean was a fraud, not an artist, just a nightclub act with a movie contract. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Brando waited for a flinch, for a fracture in the armor, for Dino to reveal something, anything that proved he was human. Nothing came. Dean paused, then let his gaze drift past Brando, past the crowd, beyond the chandeliers and champagne glasses, beyond the frightened faces of studio executives already calculating the damage. He seemed to be looking at something only he could see, something distant and untouched by the room, the party, or the man standing in front of him demanding answers. Maybe it was Steubenville, maybe the steel mills in the cold Ohio winters. Maybe it was nothing at all. Dean finally looked down at his glass, the amber liquid, the melting ice, the condensation sliding down the sides like tears. He lifted it to the light, watching the chandelier fracture and sparkle through it, swirled it once, then twice, and spoke. "Marlon," he said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't act, I show up." 43 seconds. That was how long the silence lasted. Marcus Webb counted every one of them. 43 seconds of Marlon Brando searching for a response. 43 seconds of Hollywood's greatest method actor realizing he had been beaten by a man who didn't even think of himself as an actor. 43 seconds of Dean Martin simply standing there, smiling that same lazy, effortless smile. Brando opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but nothing came. The man who could become anyone had become no one. The man who could feel everything felt something he hadn't known in years: defeat. His hands began to tremble, his eyes lost their famous intensity, and the fire that had burned so brightly moments before went out. For the first time in his career, he looked like a man who didn't know his next line. Marcus Webb watched Brando turn away, push through the crowd, and disappear into the night without saying a word to anyone. And then Marcus watched Dean Martin do something extraordinary. He ordered another drink, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just undone the greatest actor of his generation with 6 quiet words, as if the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than a mild interruption. "Same thing, pal," Dean said to the bartender, his voice calm, relaxed, almost bored, and the party rolled on. Brando left without saying goodbye. His driver later found him sitting on the curb outside, staring up at the stars, his jacket wrinkled, his hair a mess, looking like a man who had just lost a fight he hadn't known he was in. "Take me home," Brando said. He didn't speak for the entire drive, didn't move, didn't blink, just sat in the dark, replaying those 6 words again and again. "I don't act, I show up." By morning, everyone knew. Hollywood is a small town with a big mouth. The story raced through the studios, reached New York by noon, and by evening it was all anyone talked about. Some said Dean had won. Some said Brando had been drunk and it didn't count. Others called it the greatest party moment in Hollywood history. But no one disputed the line. "I don't act, I show up." It became a mantra, a philosophy, a quiet rebellion against the idea that art had to hurt. Years passed. Dean kept making movies, kept hosting his TV show, kept pretending to be drunk while sipping apple juice, and kept making it look effortless. Brando kept winning awards, kept transforming himself, kept suffering for his art, endlessly searching for something he couldn't name. They never spoke again. You might think that's where the story ends. 2 philosophies, 2 lives, 2 men who went their separate ways. But there's one last chapter. One final twist that changes everything. In 1994, Marlon Brando gave an interview to journalist Peter Manso for a biography. It was long, rambling, confessional, the kind of interview you give when you're old, tired, and no longer care what anyone thinks. And buried in the middle, Brando said something he had never revealed publicly. "Dean Martin," Brando whispered. "He understood something I never did." The journalist leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Brando paused, his eyes distant, lost in a memory from 36 years earlier. "He never tried, he never prepared, he never suffered, and yet when you watched him on screen, you believed him, you loved him, you couldn't take your eyes off him." Brando's voice cracked. "I spent my whole life learning how to act. Dean Martin spent his whole life learning how to be, and in the end, he was more real than I ever was." Marcus Webb heard about the interview years later. By then, he was retired, living in Palm Springs, 72 years old, still sharp, still remembering. He laughed when he read it. "I knew," he said, "I knew that night in 1958, when Brando walked away and Dean ordered another drink. I knew who had won." How? Because Dean didn't need to win. He didn't need anything from anyone. That's why he was untouchable. You can't beat a man who isn't fighting. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995 at 78. Marlon Brando passed in 2004 at 80. By the time they were gone, Hollywood had changed. Method acting was no longer revolutionary, it was expected. Every young actor starved themselves for roles, stayed in character, suffered. But something had been lost. We all know actors who disappear into their roles, yet never quite touch what Dean Martin had by simply showing up. We admire their dedication, their commitment, their pain. But when was the last time we saw someone who made it look effortless? Someone who walked onto a screen and made us smile without even trying? Dean Martin had that gift, the gift of seeming effortlessness. He learned it in Steubenville, in the bars where a young Dino sang for tips, in the boxing rings where he learned to take a punch without flinching, in the steel mills where he learned that showing weakness meant losing everything. He learned that the world doesn't reward suffering, it rewards survival. And survival means never letting anyone see you sweat. Brando made 40 films, won 2 Oscars, and died alone, overweight, estranged from his children, bitter at an industry that had moved on. Dean made 51 films, never won an Oscar, and died surrounded by family, loved by millions, at peace with who he was.